This is Ipoh in the Malaysian state of Perak, a city of more than 500,000 people, ringed by sheer limestone hills. Temples are built into its caves. Its old quarter is full of coffee shops and painted shophouses, and on a quiet afternoon it can feel like a place where not very much has ever happened. But scattered all around it, half hidden in the greenery, lie hundreds of still, flooded pools. To understand them and the city itself, you have to go back more than a century to Tin. The story begins with the valley. A broad basin runs between two ranges of hills, drained by the Kinta River, and for most of its history it was quiet country. Jungle, a scatter of Malay villages, and tin. The tin lay in the gravel of the valley floor, weathered out of the granite hills over millions of years. In mineral form it is called cassiterite, dark, heavy grains, easily told from sand because they sink. Malays had gathered it for generations, swirling river gravel in a shallow wooden pan, the dulang, until the heavy ore settled at the bottom. It was patient work, and on its own it supplied only a modest trade. What changed was the world outside. By the middle of the 19th century, industrial Europe and America wanted tin in bulk, for tin plate, for solder, for the cans that now preserved food, and this valley held one of the richest deposits on Earth. The first great rush, though, came not to Kinta but to Larut, in the north of Perak. In the 1840s, a Malay chief named Long Jafar opened mines there and brought in Chinese labourers from Penang to work them. Word of the find travelled back to the crowded tin districts of southern China. Through the 1860s and 70s, tens of thousands of men, most of them Hakka and Cantonese, crossed the sea to Perak. They came clan by clan and village by village, each man following kinsmen who had gone before. It was a chain of migration that would, within a generation, make the Chinese the largest community in the valley. Few came freely. Most were recruited on credit, their passage paid by the labour companies they would then work to repay, the men the Chinese called sinkeh, the new guests. Those companies, the kongsi, were part employer, part clan, part secret society. Two great rivals, the Gi Hin and the Hai San, controlled the mines, the water and the men. Through the 1860s and early 70s, they fought a series of wars over that control. The Larut Wars that drew in thousands of fighters and shut the mines for months at a time. That disorder gave Britain its opening. In 1874, by the Treaty of Pangkor, the colonial government installed a resident in Perak to advise, in practice to direct, the Sultan. The first resident, James Birch, was assassinated within a year. The British answered with troops and the system held. From then on, Perak's tin was dug under colonial order. And none of this happened in isolation. The tin flowed out through the Great Straits ports, Penang to the north, Singapore to the south, and through them the valley was wired into a global economy. Down came machinery, rice, cloth and credit. Out went the tin the world's factories needed. And in 1896 the British bound the tin states together as the Federated Malay states, governed from a new capital at Kuala Lumpur. Tin had not merely enriched a colony, it had helped draw the outline of a country. The Malay sultans kept their thrones, their titles and their ceremony. But real power now lay with the British residents and with the tin revenue they controlled. Then in the 1880s, prospectors proved that the ground further south in the Kinta Valley was richer still. The centre of the tin world shifted to towns most people had never heard of: Gopeng, Kampar, Batu Gajah. These were frontier towns, thrown up in a few years out of timber and palm thatch, loud, muddy and lit at night by the lamps of the gambling houses and opium shops that lined their streets. For the men who dug the tin, life was hard and often short. They worked in gangs, slept in company barracks, and owed most of their wages back to the kongsi for food, tools, and the debt of their passage. The colonial economy ran on more than tin. The government licensed opium, spirits and gambling, sold largely to the labourers, and drew a great part of its revenue from them. It was the hidden ledger beneath the boom. The work was hard and the turnover steady, and the mines ran on a constant arrival of new men from China. But around that labour, something larger was taking shape. Between the labourer in the pit and the magnate in his mansion, a broad middle grew. The mines needed provisioners, shopkeepers, contractors, and clerks. The trade needed agents, bookkeepers, and moneylenders. Chinese shopkeepers, Indian Cheshire financiers, Tamil and Eurasian clerks. A whole commercial society took shape around the tin, in time far larger than the mines themselves. By day, the floor of the valley was an open wound. Whole hillsides were cut back by hand, the tin-bearing earth carried out basket by basket from terraced pits that swallowed thousands of workers at once. Water did the heavy work, and moving it was a science of its own. It was lifted, channeled, and run through the washing plant, the puddling tubs and sluices that parted the heavy tin from the worthless spoil. The tin-bearing gravel was run through long wooden sluices, called the palong, where the heavy ore settled into the riffles and the lighter waste washed away downstream. It was repetitive, waterlogged work under a heavy sun, and it went on at this scale across the whole valley, day after day, for the better part of a century. All this tin built towns, and the greatest of them was Ipoh on the banks of the Kinta River. The older Malay aristocracy adapted to the new order, some of them prospering as landholders and officials within it. It grew at extraordinary speed, from a river crossing to the second town of the Federated Malay states within a single generation. A fire in 1892 cleared the old timber centre, and it was rebuilt in brick. Out of a transient mining camp, a settled town society took shape across the Federated Malay states. Piped water and electric light, railways and grand government offices, newspapers in several languages, schools and clubs. Places men had once come only to make money and leave became places where families stayed. Those rows of shophouses with their covered walkways still stand. Their streets ran on a dozen languages at once, and on the trade that tin brought, provisions, cloth, machinery and money. Walk those same streets today and the shophouses still stand, their 5-foot ways shading much the same trades, a century on. The colonial presence was thin but visible. A handful of British officials, Sikh policemen brought from India to keep order, and Tamil labourers who built and maintained the roads and the railway. The markets too are still here, the same crush of vendors and dialects that the tin first drew together. The men who profited most were not the British, but the Chinese mine owners, the towkay. A handful of them became some of the wealthiest men in Asia. Foo Choo Choon arrived from Fujian as a boy of 13. By 1911, his mine at Trono was the single largest tin producer in the world, worked by some 10,000 labourers. The press called him the Tin King. Eu Tong Sen, who inherited and expanded a string of Kinta mines, kept mansions in Ipoh and Kampar and a castle in Singapore. His name still hangs over a medicine business and a street that carry it to this day. Their mansions survive as well, follies like Kellie's castle, near Batu Gajah, still drawing visitors to wonder at the fortunes the valley could build. In their clubs, like the Hakka Miners Association in Ipoh, the towkay did business over brandy and bird's nest soup, and behind closed doors, over the opium and gambling farms that underwrote the rest of the economy. It was a world of sharp contrasts. The owner's motorcar on the new road above, and the labourer in the pit below who would never own the ground he worked. The mining communities built their own institutions to live by. Clan and district associations housed new arrivals, settled disputes, ran schools, and shipped the bones of the dead back to China for burial. In the limestone caves that rise straight out of the valley floor, they founded temples, and kept the festival calendar they had carried from the south, its processions, its opera, and its firecrackers. Those cave temples are still lit with incense today, the gods the miners carried with them keeping their place in the limestone. For most, the hope was simple: to earn enough and to go home. Many never did. The communities they built instead became permanent and, in time, Malayan. And each community kept its own faith. The Chinese their temples and clan shrines, the Tamils their gods, the Malays their mosques, and the daily rhythm of the call to prayer. From the 1900s, the work itself began to change. High-pressure water cannon, the gravel pump method, could tear down a hillside far faster than any gang of men with baskets. On the largest mines, mechanical jigs and shaking tables now sorted the ore, the first machines to enter a process that had run on muscle and running water for centuries. From the 1910s, the work grew mechanized, steam engines and pumps, and on the largest concerns, the first bucket dredges, floating steel factories that dug, washed, and sorted the tin in one continuous motion. A single dredge could do the work of thousands of men. Over the following decades, the industry and its profits passed steadily from Chinese hands into the British and Australian firms with the capital to buy the machines. By the 1920s, Malaya produced close to half the world's tin. Smelted at Penang and Singapore, Straits tin became the benchmark for the metal everywhere it was traded. The fortunes made in the valley were banked in Penang and Singapore and reinvested across the peninsula, in shipping, rubber and property, knitting the whole of British Malaya into a single tin and rubber economy. Tin and rubber were the twin pillars of the colony, and the Kinta Valley, this one stretch of ground in Perak, sat at the centre of both. The modern world arrived on the same tide as the tin: the railway up the valley, the telegraph, electric light, the motorcar. In a single lifetime, a river crossing had become one of the most modern cities in Southeast Asia. Across the peninsula, the towns the tin had built filled with traffic and trade, rickshaws and bullock carts, hawkers and shop signs in a dozen scripts. Then came the motorcar. By the 1920s, the well-to-do drove out in the evening cool, past the new banks and department stores, to the clubs and the racecourse. For the colonial middle class, there were the clubs and cricket on the padang, tennis and the turf. The Asian middle class built sporting and clan associations of their own. There were swimming clubs and seaside resorts, garden parties and brass bands, the comfortable leisure of a society that suddenly had money to spend and the time to spend it. The grand hotels kept dining rooms and bars where Europeans and wealthy Asians took tiffin, drank their whiskey sodas, and danced to imported bands. And there was the theatre, the bangsawan, the Malay opera with its painted scenery and travelling stars, and, by the 1930s, picture houses showing films from Hollywood, London and Shanghai. One of those picture houses still stands. The Ruby, an Art Deco palace that opened in 1938, its name still spelled out above the street corner long after the last film. Ipoh's railway station still stands, white and grand, built when the town believed its boom would never end. But the boom could not last. The richest ground was steadily worked out. The depression of the 1930s collapsed the price, and an international quota was imposed that favoured the big dredgers over the small Chinese miners. By the end of the 1930s, the easy ground was largely worked out, the price had turned uncertain, and the greatest days of the boom were already behind it. The valley had been remade, and the fortunes it could make had mostly been made. What the tin left behind is still written across the valley. The dredges ate the land and left water, hundreds of still, flooded pools that now mirror the sky. Ipoh's old streets have found a second life. The brick shop houses are repainted, the coffee shops full, and the boomtime mansions have become museums and galleries. Out near Batu Gajah, the last of the great dredges sits rusting in its pool, kept now as a monument to the machines that remade the valley. The tin is all but gone, but the towns it built and the people who came for it and stayed are the lasting fortune of the valley that the world once came to dig.